Good morning, everybody. This is Mark Sussman, the editor of Willamette Week. Delighted to be here this morning with Peter Graven. Peter is the lead data scientist for OHSU, and you teach courses there as well. Is that correct, Peter?
Yep, teach health economics for the School of Public Health.
And we're thrilled to have you in part because you created the model that encouraged Kate Brown to take the steps she did to close the state down. So, Peter, let's talk about the model that you built. Was it in February or March?
Early March.
Early March. You built a model and said, here's what's going to happen to Oregon if we don't change our behavior. And somehow it got to the governor's office.
Yeah, it was, it was a pretty, intense time. And we were trying to understand what was happening. And I was scrambling, working really day and night to figure out, hey, what's the best model? What's going to happen to Oregon? And, kind of moved between a few models and pretty much landed on a very simple model that just shows how cases double over time.
And so what did your model show?
Well, it showed a really, probably, I guess, disturbing picture of the number of beds that were going to be needed in the hospital across the state. So you're predicting cases, then you have to say if there's so many cases, how many of those are going to go to the hospital? How long are they going to be in the hospital when they get there? If you just combine those three things, then you can see that how many hospital beds you're going to need at any given time. And they always talk about exponential growth. That's where it goes up very fast. And so you saw a graph that went up and quickly was going to outstrip our capacity.
So you basically create a model and said, if we allow people to live and work as normal and to not socially distance or not bring around some sort of government encouragement, if not enforcement, we're going to have a bottleneck in our hospitals. And did you predict deaths and mortality?
Those that you could have done those calculations. I kept it a little less morbid than that, and just mostly focused on the healthcare capacity. But the calculation was there. It would have been a lot.
How do you model?
Well, I mean, so there are teams of modelers who were having meetings, and I joined some of them with the CDC. And the idea is you come up with a few parameters that you think will drive the model. And you're going to use as many data points as you can, but you're right, it's not the actual data necessarily, but you're going to say, oh, in Wuhan, it doubled at a rate of 6.2 days. That means every 6.2 days, we think it doubles. Maybe over in South Korea, it was longer. Maybe it was 10 days. Maybe somewhere else, it was 5 days. And you're just going to average those together or take the best estimate you think that applies to your area. So in our case, I originally used 6.2 days. And that was the kind of consensus doubling rate that existed. And it's really only one number you need to know. You need to know the doubling rate, and you need to know the first day you had a case.
And that's really the two critical pieces of information.
That is what drives the curve. Then after that, once you know who's infected, you have a number of infected, you say, well, what percent do you think will go to the hospital, right? All right, that's a number. And that was also estimated in the literature. Modelers were talking about it. And so that number was maybe 19%, maybe 10%. And then once you know.
Again, I'm sorry, Peter, how would you know what percentage of those infected would need to go to the hospital? Where would you get that data?
There again, you're looking at other countries that got hit before us. And you're trying to get the best data out of that. And if they had 1,000 people that were tested positive and they had 100 that went into the hospital, you have 10% hospitalization rate. You know that there's a bunch of other people who are asymptomatic that aren't in there, but you know of the ones that tested positive, 10% will come in. And you can use that number to help understand in your own state what that will do.
And have you done any modeling since the original model you created and delivered to the governor about this? Yeah. And are you learning?
So I mean, the big question now is not what the disease does all by itself. The big question now is what interventions do we do as a state to slow it down? That completely changes the story of this thing. And that's what we've seen in the data is that it was going up very fast. And then as soon as we did our big interventions, it came down really quite fast, almost as fast, which is great. Now the number of the rate looks to me like it's hovering a little bit, which is good because it's a pretty low rate, but also means it's not going away completely.
Let me stop you there and let's talk about that a little bit. So just elaborate a little bit. You're saying that lately the rate of infections have been hovering?
Yeah, so the metric I actually look at is the number of admits per day to the hospital. And the reason why that's a good metric is because it does not include these issues of, oh, you tested a whole bunch more people, were they high risk, were they not high risk? Your number of cases per day can be influenced by a lot of things, but I know if you get sick enough, you're gonna go to the hospital. And if you go to the hospital, we're gonna test you because nobody wants to be around somebody who's positive in the hospital.
And what have those numbers been hovering at recently?
We're looking at about 10 admits per day across the state.
Statewide, there are 10 new patients who need to be in a hospital to treat COVID per day. And you're saying that number is about what it has been for a while?
About the last 10 days.
And it's good that it isn't growing, but it's bad that it isn't shrinking.
I don't know if we fully expected it to shrink down to zero, but the fact that it's not implies that the intervention is probably it might be relaxing a little bit on its own. So people might be doing a few more things, and so it does not appear that the intervention is getting stronger over time.
Well, I guess the question is, the governor announced this morning that they're going to start to loosen restrictions. They're obviously going to do some contact tracing, but they're moving in that direction. Are you concerned that there's even talk about this at this point, given that hospital admissions are not declining?
Well, the rate that we're at, the 10 admits per day, is completely manageable. Now, it wasn't even 10 admits a day. Eventually, we got up to 30 admits a day. That becomes an issue when we didn't have stockpiles of PPE and those sorts of things in our hospital. Many of those, most places, I think, are fully replenished on their protections. They're still conserving, and sometimes, they have different policies about using it. But if you can manage the number that you think are going to come in, then it's it's a completely valid thing to think about opening up other parts of your economy.
Peter, are there any small bits of analysis or assumptions you made when doing this modeling that may not have come to the surface, but you think are worth sharing with our readers?
Let's see, the types of things that interest, well, I mean, there's obviously the things that I always like to check are the performance of Oregon compared to other places. And Oregon is in the top 5 for sure.
We're in the top 5 in terms of infections on a per capita basis, but also lower mortality. And here we are on the West Coast. We're in between arguably 2 hot spots, Seattle and a portion of California. We're proximitous to China. I'm just surprised.
Well, you can thank the governor, I would say. She took action about as early as you could have. Maybe only a few more days earlier is all you could have imagined. And that really made the difference. When you look at the data from the time we took the strong action, the decline is precipitous. It happened, it worked. And so we could have waited and done it a week later and we wouldn't have looked as good. It was the timing, and it all happened very fast before this thing happened to spread. We did get maybe a little lucky. We didn't have a lot of super spreaders events. All it takes is a couple of these, and all of a sudden you're dealing with something else. We're maybe a little fortunate, but the policy decision was made very early when it was not very when our number of cases were low.